The steel cable came up screaming that morning, the way it always does when the net has caught more than fish. It was just after 4, the 21st of a grey autumn, 40 nautical miles east of the Yorkshire coast, out where the water shallows to a strange, sunken plateau the trawlermen have always called the Dogger. The winch groaned, the boom bent, and when the cod end broke the surface and swung, streaming and heavy, over the deck, the men below it stepped back before they understood why. It was not fish. It was not the ordinary grey mass of skate and haddock and the black North Sea mud. In the decklights it was pale and jointed and wrong. When the net was released and the catch spilled across the boards, it came down not as a slither but as a clatter. A dry, knocking, bone-on-wood clatter that no living haul ever makes. And there, sliding across the salt, wet planks, tangled in weed and grey clay, was a human jaw, a lower jaw, brown as tobacco, the teeth still socketed and worn flat. Beside it, a length of thigh bone, too long and too thick to be mistaken for any seal or porpoise, and rolling to a stop against the scupper, catching the light, the smooth curve of the top of a skull. Stand there with them for a moment. Stand on that heaving deck in the dark, the diesel throbbing under your boots, the smell of the deep bottom, that black, sulphurous 1,000-year smell, rising off the pile at your feet. And understand that these men had trawled these grounds their whole lives, and their fathers before them, and they knew every wreck and every reef and every drowned airman these waters held. This was none of those. The bones were not white, they were the colour of the peat that came up with them, stained through and through, mineral-heavy, fossil-cold. These had not been in the sea for years or decades. They had been in the ground, dry ground, buried ground, land, for a length of time that has no comfortable name. And they were not alone. As the men crouched and turned the pile over with the toe of a boot, with the shaft of a gaff, unwilling at first to touch it with a bare hand, they found the rest. A block of stone, roughly square, one face worn smooth and flat in a way water does not do, the way a threshold is worn by feet or a hearthstone by fire. A piece of antler, its base sawn cleanly through and one end ground to a chisel point, shaped deliberately by a hand that knew what it wanted. A splinter of blackened timber, squared on its sides, with a peg-hole bored straight through it. Not driftwood, not wreckage. Worked, made, ordered. That is the word that hangs over this entire story, and I want you to hold it from the very first minute. Ordered. Because a drowned man is a tragedy, and a scattered bone is a curiosity, but a jaw and a hearthstone and a shaped roof beam coming up together in one net from one patch of seabed is something else entirely. It is not a death. It is a place. It is the floor of somewhere people lived, tipped up out of 40 meters of cold water and dumped, still half-assembled, onto the deck of a fishing boat in the rain of engines and radio. The skipper did what skippers do. He logged the position, a scrawl of latitude and longitude in the margin of the day's catch, and he did not, at first, know what else to do at all. There is a superstition among these crews, old and unspoken, about hauling up the dead. Some throw them straight back, quickly, without looking, and say nothing in port. Some cannot. This one kept a few pieces in a fish crate wedged under the gunwale, half because he thought a museum might want them, and half, I suspect, because he could not bring himself to give a human jaw back to the sea as though it were offal. And when he looked at that jaw again in daylight, sober, in the harbour, he saw what had unsettled him in the dark and could not put into words. The teeth were worn to the root, ground flat and even, the way teeth are worn by chewing grain full of grit, or by working sinew soft. They were the teeth of someone who had lived a hard, land-bound, ancient life. Not a sailor's teeth, not a drowned modern man's. Something older than the boat, older than the port, older than the coastline the boat had sailed from. Now here is the part that turns a strange morning into a haunting. This was not the first time, it was not the 100th. Out on the Dogger, across the whole shallow sprawl of the southern North Sea, the nets have been coming up like this for as long as there have been nets deep enough to reach the bottom. Trawlermen have a name for the black lumps that foul their gear out there. Moorlog, they call it, the compressed peat of a drowned bog, and it comes up in stinking rafts that they curse and cut away. And tangled in that peat over the generations has come everything a bog holds, antler harpoons. The bones of animals that do not swim, deer, wild horse, bison, the great tusks of mammoth and the flat grinding molars of elephant, hauled from the floor of a sea 60 miles from the nearest shore. And, more often than the record likes to admit, the bones of people. They came up and they went back over the side. That is the quiet, terrible heart of it. Not into a museum, not into a laboratory. Back into the water, or into the ballast, or crushed under the next haul, logged as a nuisance if they were logged at all. Because a fisherman 40 miles out has a hold to fill and a tide to catch, and a brown human skull tangled in the peat is, to him, a problem, not a discovery. How many centuries of that? How many jaws and skulls and shaped stones lifted for a moment into the light of a deck lamp, turned over, frowned at, and let go, before anyone thought to ask the only question that matters, which is this: what land is down there? What settled, ordered, inhabited land lies drowned beneath the Dogger bank, deep enough to be forgotten and shallow enough that a fishing net can still, on a bad morning, catch its rooftops and its dead and pull them up, dripping into a century that insists no such place ever existed? To answer that, you have to go back to a single object, hauled up on a September morning in 1931, that did more than any skull to force the question into the open. The trawler was the Calinda, working the Lehman and Ower banks off the Norfolk coast, some 25 miles out over water that fell only 100 feet or so to the bottom. Her skipper, Pilgrim Lockwood, dragged his net through the moorlog in the dark before dawn, and when the catch came up, there was a black slab of peat in it, the size of a chest, heavy and sodden and reeking of a marsh that no living man had ever walked. His mate went at it with a shovel to break it loose and clear the deck. The blade struck something that was not peat. It rang, dull and hard, the way iron rings, and it turned the edge of the shovel. Inside the block, embedded in the compressed bog, was a spear, not a fragment, a worked point of red deer antler, better than 8 inches long, one edge cut with a row of fine barbs, shaped and finished and hafted by a hand that knew exactly what it was making. Lockwood, to his lasting credit, did not throw it back. He kept it. He carried it home, and it passed to a man named Muir Evans, and from Evans it reached the desk of Harry Godwin and, in time, the eyes of the archaeologist Graham Clark. When they dated the peat around it, decades later, by the radiocarbon method that did not yet exist in 1931, the answer came back in numbers that stop the breath. The point was some 11, 12, 13,000 years old. It had been made on dry land. It had been made in a forest, beside slow rivers, on a plain where deer grazed and men hunted them, in a country that lay where the fishing fleet now dragged its nets. That single barbed point did something the centuries of discarded bone had never quite managed. It proved that the floor of the North Sea had once been a surface, not a coast that had crumbled a little at the edges, a whole interior, a land with a middle to it, far from any sea, with weather and seasons and people who lived and died there and left the tools of their living in the peat of its bogs. The sea we call the North Sea is not old. 12,000 years ago, you could have walked from the low fields of what is now Yorkshire, dry-shod, all the way to the Netherlands, and never known you were crossing anything but a broad, marshy, well-watered plain, threaded with rivers and dotted with lakes and reed beds and low wooded hills. The men who study it now have given it a careful, bloodless name, Doggerland, as though naming a thing tamed it. But the name is younger than my grandmother. For every century before the 1990s, This was simply the place the nets fouled and the bones came up, and nobody dared to say what it was, because once you know to look, the evidence is staggering, and it has been surfacing the whole time. Go into the older museum registers along the eastern coast, into the marine collections at places like Norwich and Leiden and Hull, and read the acquisition notes for the dredged material. Mammoth molars by the crate, the antler and bone of a vanished fauna, red deer and roe deer, aurochs, the wild horse, the woolly rhinoceros, the brown bear. Barbed points like the Kalinda spear turning up again and again in the moorlog. And threaded through it all, the human remains that the record handles with such reluctance, a skull fragment here, a piece of jaw there, logged in a clerk's dry hand as recovered by trawl, provenance uncertain, and then filed away and forgotten. In 1931, the same year as the spear, a fisherman is said to have brought up a piece of worked timber, a beam blackened and bored by shipworm, its surface still carrying the flat faces and squared corners of a tool, a roof beam, some said quietly, a structural timber, a piece of a building, 60 feet under the sea. It was noted, and it was not kept, and today you will not find it in any case in any museum, only in the margins of the story where so much of this evidence lives. That is the pattern, and it is the whole horror of it in miniature. The thing surfaces, a hand touches it, and the moment passes without a name being spoken. I have spent long enough in this material to feel the weight of what was let go, the drifts of bone that went back over the side because there was no category to receive them, no line on the manifest for the dead of a country that the maps insisted had never been. A dredger clears a shipping channel and logs, in passing, a quantity of animal and human bone brought up with the spoil, and dumps it on a bank offshore, and the entry is 3 lines long. Aggregate companies working the same banks for gravel to build our roads, and our runways have been pulling up the crushed remains of this world for 100 years, and only a handful of the men on those barges ever thought that the brown, water-heavy lump in their sieve had once had a face. And then there is the question that hangs over all of it, the one that separates this from an ordinary story of rising seas. Look at what the peat records. Not a slow, patient drowning, generation by generation, field by field, the sort of thing a people would watch and retreat from and remember in their oldest tales. In the layers, in more than one core pulled from that seabed, there is a signature, a sudden sheet of pale marine sand driven violently across the old land surface, over the peat and the forest soil. A single blade of the sea laid flat over the country in what must have been hours. A surge, a wall of water that came in over the low plain and did not go back out. The men who study those cores speak of it cautiously in the language of their discipline, and I will come to their explanation and give it the full and honest weight it deserves. But strip the caution away, and the layer says something a child could read. One day there was land. And then, in a single tide, there was not. And everything that had lived on it, the deer and the horses and the bear and the men with their barbed antler spears, went down together under the same grey water and stayed down and has been coming back up in pieces ever since. That is what the net broke the surface with, that haunting September morning. Not a stray bone, not a curiosity, a fragment of a drowned country ordered and inhabited and swallowed whole, that a fishing fleet has been dredging up for 200 years while every chart in the wheelhouse swore the water there had no bottom worth naming. The finders touched it and let it go, again and again and again, because to keep it, to log it honestly, to carry it ashore and set it on a table and say the word aloud, settlement, people, drowned, was to admit something about the map that the map was not built to hold. So where, then, did the land go? And why can no one today put a finger on the chart and say, here, this is where it stood? The honest answer begins with a confession about the map itself. There is no chart of that drowned country because a chart is a record of a coast a living person walked, and no living person ever walked that coast and came back to draw it. What we call the Dogger Bank on our modern hydrographic surveys is not a memory of the land, it is the tombstone. It is the highest surviving ridge of a plain that once ran unbroken from the mouth of the Thames to the Danish shore, and everything lower than that ridge, the valleys, the lakes, the river that geologists have traced running north through the middle of it, the estuary where the antler tools cluster thickest. All of it lies beneath 120, 130 feet of cold water, buried further still under the marine sand that the surge laid down and the tides have been combing flat for 8,000 years. You cannot chart a place that was erased before charts existed, and so the erasure was never an act, it was an absence. The land did not disappear from the map, it drowned before anyone alive had a map to lose it from. I want you to sit with how complete that is, because it is the quiet mechanism at the heart of this whole account. There was no order given to strike the country from the record. There was no archive burned, no survey suppressed, no cartographer told to leave the water blank. There was simply a plain full of people that went under the sea 40 centuries before the first Sumerian pressed a reed into wet clay, and by the time human beings learned to write down where they lived and draw the edges of their world, the drowned country was already a myth's worth of years in the past, already unreachable, already unmarked. That is how a whole inhabited lowland vanishes without a conspiracy, not by censorship, by time, by the simple fact that the witnesses and their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren were all lying under the same grey water as the land they would have testified to. But there is a second erasure, and this one is ongoing, and this one is human, and it is the part I find harder to forgive. Because the bones did come back. The skulls, the worked flint, the barbed points, the roof beam hauled up barnacled in 1931, the sea returned them over and over into hands that could have logged them, that could have carried them to a museum, that could have written the honest sentence, and for the better part of 2 centuries those hands let them go. Not out of malice, out of something quieter and more corrosive, the certainty that they could not be what they plainly were. A trawlerman who has been told his whole working life that the Dogger is a sandbank, a fishing ground, an empty stretch of nautical nothing, does not carry a human skull into the harbour master's office. He does not want the questions. He does not want the delay, the inquiry, the coroner, the reporters. He tips it back over the rail, and he watches it go down, and he says nothing, and the record stays clean, and the map stays right. Because the alternative is to be the man who says the sea is full of people and to be looked at the way we look at such men. The country was drowned by water once. It has been drowned a second time, slowly, by embarrassment. And when at last the scientists did come, and they came properly, with corers and seismic survey and radiocarbon dates, in the great programs that ran through the 2000s out of the British universities, the ones that finally gave the drowned plain a name and mapped its rivers from the sound shadows in the sediment. They gave us the truth and they gave us the caution in the same breath. Their word for what happened is subsidence. The land, they say, was not struck down in a day. The ice that had pressed down on the north for tens of thousands of years melted, and the sea it released rose, foot by patient foot, century by century, and the crust itself flexed and sagged as the weight came off it, and the plain sank as the water climbed, and the 2 movements met in the middle, and the country drowned the way a beach drowns at the turn of the tide, slowly, legibly, survivably. A retreat, not a catastrophe. A people who saw the water coming and moved their camps inland a mile in a generation and told stories about the good land their grandfathers had hunted, now gone under. And then, on top of that slow drowning, they place the surge. Around 8,200 years ago, off the coast of Norway, a piece of the continental shelf the size of a country broke loose and slid into the deep, the Storegga Slide, one of the largest submarine landslides the Earth has left us evidence of, and it threw up a tsunami that raced south across the shrinking plain and drove that sheet of pale marine sand across the old land surface, the blade of sea I described to you in the cause. That, they say, is your wall of water, not the drowning of the country. The country was already half gone, but the drowning of its last low remnant, the final islands, in a single afternoon. A real wave, a dated wave, a wave with a cause a geologist can point to on a map of Norway. I have read their papers and I find them persuasive. I want to say that plainly, because everything I have shown you sits inside their framework and does not break it. The subsidence is real. The Storegga wave is real, in the sediment, in the dates, in the pale sand lying flat over the peat exactly where they said it would lie. If you ask me what erased the land, the honest scientific answer, rising seas and a flexing crust and one enormous slide off the Norwegian shelf, explains the geology completely, and it needs no lost civilization, no vanished empire, no name struck from a chart to do it. I concede that. I concede almost all of it. And yet, there is the one bone it does not touch. Because subsidence and tsunami explain the drowning of a land. They do not explain the population of it. They tell you with beautiful precision how the water came in. They are entirely silent on the question of how many people it came in over time, and the answer the sea keeps giving, skull by skull, jaw by jaw, spear by barbed spear, hauled up in the cod nets and tipped back over the rail, is more than we have ever been willing to count. We are told this was empty ground, a marginal hunting range crossed by a few thin bands of the Mesolithic, a place with no settlement worth the word. And then the same sea that we insist was never truly lived on returns, decade after decade, its quiet, steady census of the dead, worked stone that was shaped by someone sitting still and safe enough to shape it, human bone in a quantity that speaks not of a few lost hunters, but of a country that was inhabited and lived in and mourned in for far longer than we have allowed. So go and look. The dredging logs exist. The Rotterdam and Yarmouth collections exist. The cores are published. The dates are published. The pale sand is there in the record with a catalogue number. You can hold the honest science in one hand, and in the other you can hold the plain, stubborn, unresolved fact that a fishing fleet has spent 200 years pulling human dead out of a place the map swears no one ever called home. That is where the net broke the surface, that September morning off the Dogger, spilling bones too old and too ordered onto a steel deck over water charted as empty. The men looked at it, and they knew, the way you know a thing before you have permission to know it. And then they let it go back down. The sea will send it up again. It always does. And the only question left, the one no core and no coastline and no cautious paper has ever managed to answer, is the simplest one, and the heaviest. If there was no one there, who does the North Sea keep giving back? I have spent a long time now with that question, and I want to tell you honestly where it has left me, because I do not think it leaves you anywhere clean. Let me give the skeptics their full weight, because they have earned it, and because the honest version of this story is more disturbing than the loud version. The strongest explanation, the one endorsed by nearly every marine geologist who has looked at the Dogger cores, is that there is no mystery here at all. Only a failure of imagination on the part of people who cannot picture a coastline moving. The North Sea floor, they say, was not sea at the end of the last glaciation. It was a vast low plain, drained and habitable, stretching from the coast of Norfolk to the coast of Denmark, a land that geographers now call Doggerland after the shallow bank where the fishermen keep dragging up its remains. As the ice sheets melted, the sea rose, slowly, over thousands of years, metre by patient metre, and the plain drowned the way a beach drowns under an incoming tide, not in an afternoon, but in a lifetime, and then another, until the last high ground, the Dogger Bank itself, became an island, and then a shoal, and then nothing but a name on a shipping forecast. The bones, they say, are exactly what you would expect. People lived on that plain. When it flooded, their remains went down with the ground they stood on, and the trawlers have been dredging up an ordinary drowned landscape ever since. No catastrophe, no erased empire, no Tartaria, just a coastline that walked inland while human beings watched, and a sea that has been slowly digesting a country for 8,000 years. I find this persuasive. I want you to hear that plainly, because I have no interest in selling you a lie dressed as a wonder. The radiocarbon dates are real. The pollen is real. The peat, the tree stumps, the freshwater mollusks pulled up in the same nets as the human jaws. All of it says land, and it says land that went under water, and the mainstream account of how it went under is careful, tested, and almost certainly true in its bones. If you asked me to bet, I would bet with the geologists. The plain was real. It drowned. That much is not in question. And yet, there is a seam in that explanation that the geologists themselves do not close, and I have watched them not close it for weeks. A slow drowning, a metre a century, a coast that retreats at the pace of grass, leaves a certain kind of record. It leaves people who moved. It leaves a thinning, a drift inland, generation by generation, abandoning the low ground for the high, following the retreat with their feet, taking their dead with them. A slow drowning does not leave a census on the seabed. It does not leave worked stone lying in ordered scatter where the last hand set it down. It does not leave human bone in the quantity these nets keep returning. Not the stray, drowned hunter, but the sustained, decade-on-decade recovery of the dead of a settled place. And it does not, as the Storega cores insist it did, leave one pale sheet of sand laid flat across the whole drowned country at a single moment, the signature of a wave, a single catastrophic surge off the Norwegian shelf some 8,000 years ago that ran across the last of the plain in a matter of hours and buried whatever was standing on it. That is the thing the two explanations cannot both be true about. The slow tide and the single wave are not the same story, and the sea, in what it keeps giving back, seems to be answering in favour of the wave, because you do not get a country's worth of dead from a coastline that let people walk away. You get it from a morning when there was nowhere left to walk. I have come to think the erasure here is not a conspiracy, and I want to be clear about that too, because it would be easier if it were. No one burned the charts of Doggerland. No archive was sealed. What happened is quieter and, in its way, worse. A dredger captain out of Yarmouth hauls up a human skull in his cod net at 4 a.m, and he has a quota to make and a tide to catch, and there is no line on any form for what he is holding, and no address to send it to, and so he does the only thing the day allows. He tips it back over the rail, and he says nothing, because a man who tells that story too often becomes a man other men stop drinking with. Multiply that by 200 years and 1,000 boats. That is how a country is unremembered without a single order being given. Not by suppression, by the absence of a place to put the evidence, by each finder deciding alone in the cold that it was not his to name. The record did not get destroyed. It got tipped, one bone at a time, back into the water it came from, logged as bycatch if it was logged at all, and then let go. And so we arrive at the place the whole investigation has been walking toward, and I find I have nothing to soften it with. We insist the plain was empty of anything worth calling a home. We insist the drowning was slow and gentle and gave everyone time. And the sea, which does not read our papers and does not respect our categories, goes on doing the one thing it has done without interruption since the first Renaissance fisherman logged the first strange bone. It goes on returning the dead, not a few, not the stray. A steady, patient, uncounted stream of jaws and skulls and shaped stone coming up out of water we have marked on every chart as open, empty, and unpeopled. Go back with me, one last time, to that steel deck off the Dogger. September light, flat and grey, the winch straining, the net breaking the surface heavy with something that was not fish, and then the spill of it across the plates, The long bones and the ordered stone and the round, unmistakable weight of a human skull rolling to rest against a scupper, staring up at men who had no word they were allowed to say. They knew. They knew the way you know a thing before anyone gives you permission, and then they did what every finder before them had done. They let it go back down. The cable slackened, the sea took it, and the deck was empty again, and the map was still right, and no one had to explain anything. The sea will send it up again. It always does. And I am left holding the one question that no core and no coastline and no careful, honest, published paper has ever answered, the simplest one and the heaviest, and the only one that matters now. If there was no one there, who does the North Sea keep giving back?